So, the humanistic perspective. Carol made decisions about her life based on her own personal values. She's an incredibly positive person, and when people might turn away from a social problem, she sort of gravitates towards it. She kind of shows this in her early adulthood, not only with her work with deaf children and speech and learning ASL, but in the jobs that she chooses, in her international adoption, in absorbing herself in as many other cultures as she can. She felt responsible for her worldly experience, or their lack thereof, and she sort of did something about it and was constantly trying to learn more and expose herself and her children to different worldly things. Carol did not wait to get married to start a family, and I think that correlates with a humanistic perspective, because she decided to control her own destiny and not rely on fate. She decided to not rely on anyone else to start the family that she dreamed of, and that there was no reason to wait. And I thought that was really kind of beautiful. Attachment theory. So I could not help but add this one in. I don't know if this is okay or not, but anyway, so I identify and apply the additional theoretical perspective that sheds light on aspects or phrases of an interviewee's life. The additional theory does not need to be discussed in each developmental phase. So I kind of just put in a little bit of background that attachment is the bond or relationship between the infant and caregivers, and that Ainsworth developed the 4 levels of attachment, which were secure, insecure, avoidant, insecure, resistant, and insecure, disorganized. Carol would describe herself as having a secure attachment in when she was kind of growing up, and when she was an infant to a toddler, and she always felt very loving, like she had very loving and connected parents, and she would run to them if she was hurt or feeling fearful when she was a child. That's something that we talked a lot about. We both have in common that I'm a foster parent, she's an adoptive parent. We talked a lot about attachment and how it sort of impacted her life, that word, as an adoptive mom. Poverty never affected her attachment, she said, but as she got older, she started to keep things to herself because she didn't want to burden her family with it. But that was not because they would not help her, but because she was just very independent, and according to her, because she had a secure attachment, she had a model for appropriate attachment. She said that it would be very difficult for someone who had experienced appropriate attachment to behave in ways that would provide an appropriate level of attachment to an adopted child. To any child, but also specifically to an adopted child. Carol said she remembered her mother and her siblings all having very healthy attachments to their mother, and she remembers a very loving childhood. 2 of Carol's adopted children were diagnosed with reactive attachment disorder, which was why we talked a lot about attachment and how her experience as a parent raising children with attachment disorders, and how she sort of drew on her own experience and had to learn as much as she could about adoptive attachment disorders, even though they weren't called that, and she didn't have that terminology. She knew that the behaviors that she was kind of seeing from her children were not typical developmentally appropriate behaviors, and that they were sort of similar to ones that her other in her adoption support group network were experiencing, and they were not seemed to be the same experiences that people that were having biological children that she was friends with were having. Okay, so researchers would argue that the reversal of stages is needed when it comes to Erikson's limitations, because the identity development of a woman is based on her connection to others rather than her connection to herself. When Erikson developed the theory, his stages of development, it was kind of all based on men, and a very narrow approach to the people that he was sort of examining. This whole concept kind of really had me thinking about whether or not the different approaches and the different lenses could be really used with Erikson's stages if they weren't being considered when these stages were developed. Would it matter if it was from a feminist perspective or an LGBTQIA perspective or different from the perspective of any other marginalized group or somebody with cognitive or physical disabilities. Theories do not account for trauma or any sort of neurodivergence, so I thought that that was a relevant thing to consider. Attachment theory limitations. There's not enough data on how attachment affects adults. There's not enough information on how attachment affects race, culture, social class, sexuality, neurodiversity, or the mother's health. Where mothers are consistently mentioned regarding positive developmental attachment outcomes, there doesn't seem to be enough research on a father or other significant caregiver's level of responsibility for attachment outcomes. A few other observations. I did notice that biological and behavioral influences on language and development were a focus for Carol in her academic employment, home life, and with her adopted children. The behavioral development seemed to be not only a topic for our class assignment, but also in her life and what she was interested in. When a person becomes a parent, there's a level of attachment that develops for a parent. Studying the developmental stages that a parent's brain goes through as a person shifts from an individual to a caretaker is a process I think might be worth studying. A parent developing a healthy attachment towards their child is important. I was doing a lot of research, and it seems like we focus more on the child's reaction to the parent, and there's not a lot of research done on the parent's reaction to the child. And I think that if these mirror neurons are so they're so important, and we're kind of feeding back this information, that maybe going from that direction would be an interesting study. And it would allow us to perform an action when we see someone else perform an action. In the case of avoidant attachment, children whose parents seem uninterested will pick up on the feeling that there is no internal intention for the caregiver to know me. Some children will then experience that there is no one to know, and there is a deep sense of emptiness. When those children grow up, they look at the world like there is only a physical world, or the world is one-dimensional. Children that grow up with avoidant attachment disorder sort of feel like there's only that physical world, and they are only able to report back on that because they've never experienced someone feeling anything other than that. We use postpartum as an umbrella term for parents not showing signs of healthy attachment, but these parents could have attachment disorders themselves, or a genetic predisposition that they're passing down that makes their child more susceptible to an attachment disorder when combined with their environment. Perinatal and early postnatal environmental risk factors may interact with heritable factors to shape a child's early behavioral emotional patterns, which may in turn have an effect on future developmental outcomes, such as disorganized attachment, which when I was researching disorganized attachment and really looking up a lot of these articles, there didn't seem to be a whole lot of distinction between reactive attachment and disorganized attachment. It just seemed like a different word for it. But anyway, I thought those things were a little bit interesting, and they sort of like all interconnected with Carol's story and the attachment and developmental behavioral things that she was dealing with her children, and how that related to her being an early adult and what she was seeing of those behaviors. Well, that is it. Thank you so much for listening. All right. Bye.